If we were meant to talk more than we listen, we'd have 2 mouths and 1 ear.
This podcast is brought to you by ArchMed, fast and focused design and manufacturing.
I'm Greg Maurer, founder and owner of ArchMed.
And I'm Caroline Squattrigo, talent engagement specialist. We are on a journey to grow, learn, and gain expertise in small to mid-size company culture. Join us. Greg, what's the question of the day?
I'm sorry, Caroline, did you say something? I wasn't listening.
Okay.
Okay, today we are going to talk about how to become a better listener and what a great listening culture can do for an organization. So first, we have our famous or perhaps infamous intern, Gavin, to tell us a story about how he learned what good listening can do. And next, we'll be joined by Paul Ashley, who is the Senior Vice President at First Person, to hear about the art of listening and how that's impacted his career and the organizations that he consults with. So this should be a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. Today we are joined by our lovely intern, Gavin. He is really the reason that we are having this episode today. He brought up this topic to us, the art of listening, and he also found us our guest that we'll be hearing from in a little bit, Paul Ashley. Now, Paul was your professor at Butler University, right, Gavin?
Correct, he was. Yes, he was my sales professor.
So I think after you took his class, that's really what made you bring this topic to us. So tell us a little bit about the impact that this had on you and a little bit of an overview of what Paul taught you.
Yeah, so noticing it right away after we kind of went over the subject of like art of listening, and we learned it more from a sales standpoint. And one of the things we talked about is, from a sales standpoint, like who does the best in sales, and we looked at extroverts, introverts, and we actually found out that neither of them do the best in sales. It's actually called ambiverts or ambiverts, and that's because they have the ability to talk like an extrovert, but more importantly, listen like an introvert. And so I kind of took that and then noticed it in my classwork. And I noticed that the classes I did a lot better in were the ones where I was actively listening a lot more. And then to touch also on the subject of listening is what makes us actively listen. And it generally comes from just how curious you are about something. So I saw that the classes where I had a lot more success in were the classes I was very curious about, learning those topics. And then that translated to me actually listening a lot better in those classes. And then obviously I saw the results, through the grades.
So I'm curious, did this curiosity lead to you asking more questions in class, or did it just lead to better listening, or how does this all come together?
Yeah, so definitely, I would definitely say I asked a lot more questions. And I noticed it right now in one of my classes. It's actually probably my hardest class I've taken at Butler, but it's my best grade. And I've noticed that I ask 2 to 3 questions every day because I'm actually, curious about this subject. And I think seeing it in school has also helped me realize it in other aspects of life, especially like now, having this internship. And then, a big one is just in my relationships in my life. And, the more curious I am about something, the more questions I'm asking and the more I'm taking in. Just because if you, have that curiosity, you're actually wanting to understand what people are actually telling you. And that just helps you with, kind of actively listening rather than just, being there and kind of zoning out whatever someone's saying.
Well, cool. It sounds like Paul has definitely had this very positive impact on you, not only in school, but in your personal life. And I think that's always a cool thing to have a professor or really anyone in your life that can have that impact on you. So, I mean, I'm excited to meet him. We've never talked to him. Greg and I have never talked to Paul. So, we're excited to meet the man himself and learn more about this from him.
Today we will be joined by Paul Ashley. Paul is a senior vice president and advisor for First Person, which is a Indianapolis-based benefits and compensation advisory firm. Paul is also an adjunct professor at Butler University, where I had the honor to meet Paul as I took his sales and management class. This is also where the topic for the podcast had come from, as one of the main things I took away from Paul's class is how the art of listening plays a huge role in the success of sales, but not only in just sales. I think this is something that can be implemented into relationships, along with relationships within an organization and the culture that can be built around the art of listening. So Paul, it's good to see you again, and I'm excited to hop into this.
Absolutely my pleasure. Good to see you again, my fair student.
And thanks, Gavin, for doing that introduction for us. I think we've talked about Gavin before, but if you guys haven't heard about him yet, he is our wonderful intern who helps us on the production side. And he brought Paul Ashley to us, and we're very grateful for that and had the pleasure of being in Paul's class. So we thought he should do the intro here. Paul, I have heard wonderful things about you, so I'm excited that we finally get to meet. I know Gavin was really looking forward to having you on the podcast. And he brought this topic to us and felt really strongly that we talk through it because I know it's had an impact on him. So I tend to start broadly in my questions and then we narrow as we get in. But I mean, this is really about communication, right? And I know like we hear all the time how important communication is in the workplace. It's one of those soft skills that's always ranked highly on, we want our people to have good communication skills. Do people tend to overlook listening in that in that formula, in the communication formula, or I feel like it's often more centered on how to talk to somebody?
I think it's absolutely true that the skill of listening is one of the hardest skills to master. The reason being is, I mean, think about it selfishly. We enjoy talking about ourselves, right? It our ego gets fed, and we enjoy being asked questions. And so the irony of me being on this podcast is I'm trying to talk about being a good listener, and in fact, I don't get to listen. I'm talking, so it feels kind of counterproductive. But it's a really difficult skill because our natural inclination is to discuss ourselves. And I think the magic formula for folks, whether it's what Gavin and I and his classmates talked about at Butler, uh, in the sales realm or any other business realm or personal relationships for that matter, I think the magic ingredient is curiosity. That you need to remain ridiculously curious. And in doing so, that will make you a student, an investigator, a journalist, whatever you want to describe it, in a situation where you're in business or life, learning about something, right? Learning about a business need somebody has, learning about a new relationship or partner, navigating the internal politics of your organization. Being ridiculously curious helps you to be naturally a good listener. So instead of setting a goal of I want to be a better listener, say to yourself, I want to be the kind of person who's curious all the time. And a byproduct of that is good listening.
Yeah, I like that idea that the focus is on being curious and the byproduct will come. Here's Paul, where I run into a little bit of trouble. For whatever reason, earlier in my career, I sort of landed on this concept that if I could be quick in my retorts, if I could reply without a pause, that would be a signal that I am knowledgeable, that I have something of value to add, that I'm smart, versus sitting with an awkward silence and contemplating and forming my response after fully listening to that person. So and for a long time I thought that was the way to go, and it's hard to undo that. And so if I was to sit and listen fully engaged, um, and not formulate my reply and my retort, then it would take me some period of time, 10 seconds, 20 seconds, which can feel like an eternity. So that's what I run into. I don't know, whether you've ever encountered anything like that.
I certainly have. About what age did you have that realization?
I okay, so here's a story. I made a vendor who was visiting us, who was underperforming, cry in the middle of a meeting, unintentionally. She excused herself, and I looked at my business partner. And I said, "I have no idea what just happened," and that put me on this EQ journey. And the EQ journey I went on, and I went on 5, 6 years ago. Um, One of the outputs from that process was you need to actively listen. And so I was in my upper 30s, or right around there. I'm 45 now, so I guess call it 38, 39, 40, where based on this instruction to be better at the emotional quotient, I became an active listener.
And I think that's a natural timing. And I guess I would say, um, in my experience, I think females get there faster than males do. But I think in the late 30s is about when that aha moment happens. Hopefully, for some people, it happens earlier. But I think we enter into the workforce thinking that we have to have all the answers because we spent all this year being taught and trained. And so we think we have to have the answers, when in actuality, some of the best business people, best consultants, best advisors aren't the ones who have the right answers, but instead the best questions, in my experience. And don't get me wrong, you can't be that consultant that only asks questions and never has an answer. Like that's annoying. And as you're working with a business in whatever field you're in, really discovering what the root of their aspirations or problem is really who makes the best advisor, business person, solver of problems. Because quite often, I think we present a problem up front, and then we realize that the real problem is a layer deeper than that. It's something else. That's more of a symptom, and the real problem is something else. And yeah, I think I was probably in my mid to late 30s as well, Greg, when I realized that being the best advisor to my clients wasn't necessarily having the quickest answer, fastest, but instead being more deliberative and thoughtful and using silence. And silence is a powerful tool. It's a very awkward tool, but it can be a powerful tool. And I think when we're when we're in a sales situation or a discovery process or a problem solving process or internal politics, asking a good open ended question and then shutting up and just sitting in silence can be ridiculously powerful. It really can be.
This idea kind of makes me think about I don't know if you've read the book Multipliers, but we read it and talked about it a bit on the podcast. And they talk a lot about leaders tend to just like start the conversation and kind of they can bulldoze through everybody else's input, right? And I'm somebody who I think can do that, so that was a good moment of realization for me. But I think it's that silence of I hate the awkward silence. So like that, and I think that's when I tend to do things like that and not give people the space to speak, because I'll ask a question or somebody will ask a question. It's like 2 or 3 seconds is typically my limit where I'm like, okay, this is bad. Somebody needs to say something. But I think to your point, then, a lot of people maybe just need to sit and think for a second. And I shouldn't be assuming that my awkwardness is felt all around the room. But I'm curious, it sounds like you've had a lot of experience leading up to this realization of active listening. Can you share a story of when there was a conflict that could have just easily been prevented had somebody been listening to what the other person was really saying?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of one today that actually came up with a customer. I wouldn't call it a conflict, but went into a conversation with a family-owned business, the fourth generation leader, and the next generation, fifth generation leader up. So we're talking about 5 generations of leadership in a really prominent, closely held family business that's got great success. Myself and another advisor went in based on a prior conversation, assuming we needed to solve a particular problem. And as we reiterated the prior conversation and then started asking open-ended questions, um, we we kept trying to pivot back to the original problem because we knew there was an opportunity there, a way to make money. And we caught ourselves about halfway through. She messaged me privately on Zoom and said, "Paul, we need to listen better. They're actually identifying a bigger need problem that they want to solve first." And we thought it was a compensation issue with their C-suite was problem number one. We thought frontline was number two, but it actually turned out that the middle tier was where they had the biggest need. And if we had kept going down the track that we thought we should go down and knew there was an easy for us solve, right, obvious solve, we would have missed their real issue, and we could have disappointed a client. We could have missed a sales opportunity. We could have not solved their problem. And I'm so thankful. I mean, here I am, a guy who apparently is an adjunct instructor at Butler, instructing people like Gavin and his classmates to be active listeners. And I fell into my own trap that I teach people not to. And luckily, I had another colleague with me that said, "Hey, Paul, you're not listening. Like, let's do it." And so that just happened this morning, not too ironically.
Is a component of that being with your experience and acumen confident that you are right, confident that you know what the issue is that needs to be addressed? Because that's another problem I run into is I feel confident about a particular decision or position, and I have to remind myself as I go into a discussion with other people who have different positions on the same issue that I very well could be wrong. And luckily, for whatever reason, I much prefer to have the right answer than to be right. So I
Yeah,
much
of
rather have
course.
the better outcome than to be right. But still, it's a challenge, because we're trained as sort of the advocacy kind of approach to solving issues, right? You advocate for your position, I'll advocate for my position, rather than collaboratively discussing the possible solutions and picking one that works the best.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, you kind of come into certain situations dug in, right? Especially internally, where
Yeah,
it's
dug
my
in.
opinion versus them. Less so with customers because you sort of bend into the customer a little more naturally than you do internally, which probably isn't a good behavior. We should probably treat our internal colleagues the same way we do customers and be more collaborative. Like that's probably a lesson. And I think the way to maybe a way to deal with, and by the way, there are certain things that are just non-negotiable that you have to stand your ground because it would be a violation of core values or a violation of best practices. So those as a leader, those things do come
Right,
up. Let's be
right.
clear about that. And whether it's external or internal, I think the way to help that is again, it goes back to being curious, which is, and as you're working through a conflict or a challenge, give people options, right? Maybe the outcome is this, maybe the outcome is this, or maybe the outcome is this. And you have to obviously be okay with all three outcomes, but you're giving the other person in the conversation a chance to choose a path that you also are okay with. And I think that's, and it requires curiosity to be intellectually okay with multiple outcomes. And I think it also helps to reduce conflict. And instead of it being conflict, it becomes collaboration when you create optioning. Now, again, this is a sandwich here. There are things, there are hills you have to die on that are non negotiables and no options exist, like violating core values, things of that nature. So, there are times where you do have to die on a hill. I also think, and Gavin might remember this from our class, and this was a teaching from, and if you want to link people to this, you can. There's a gentleman named Brian Neal who is who owns a consulting company called Blind Zebra, based in Indianapolis, Indiana, and he's also a full-time NFL football official. So pretty cool guy, right? I think Gavin realized that he had a terrible professor once he heard from Brian, but nevertheless, the reality is that when we go into any selling situation, any internal politics, any trying to move people from one position to the other, there are kind of these three things that have to exist. There is an abundance mentality. I have to be abundant in my thinking, that there's multiple possibilities. And in sales, that I may not be the answer, and that's okay, because there are an abundance of opportunities out there. So abundance mentality thinking, as opposed to sort of um, a scarcity thinking, would be the opposite of it, right? So abundance versus scarcity. Number two, you have to be personally detached from the outcome. Meaning, not meaning that you don't care what the outcome is, but that you realize that it doesn't directly impact the value you are as a person. And Brian always talks about it as a football official, that they're yelling at the stripes on my shirt, not Brian Neal, the human, right? And the last thing that has to be present is good intention, that you show up with the intent to be helpful, solve problems, and be collaborative. So if you have abundance thinking, detachment, personal detachment from outcomes, and positive intent, listening well, selling easily, helping people, internal politics become pretty darn easy. And I steal that directly from Brian Neal and happily give him credit, because it's a beautiful way to think about anything you face in life.
That's gold right there. And yeah, we'd love to link to Brian Neal. Um, yeah, we're always trying to solve problems with this podcast, because we came up with these questions and concerns based on our true desire to improve our company culture and our ability to manage and foster culture. So these tangible uh, items that you just mentioned, the abundant mentality and personal detachment and good intentions, are really what we're trying to figure out here.
Yeah, and
So
the way Brian explains it, just to clarify, that's a mindset, right?
yeah,
That's that you have to put in new software into the hardware of your mind, and have that be your mindset when you're in an argument with your spouse, argument with your kids, internal conflict at the office, selling, customer service. That's your, if you can hardwire that or if you can put that software into the hardwiring, boy, you're just going to have better outcomes.
so let me ask you a devil's advocate question based on this. And comes from some instances that I deal with. Um, I have to take a position and win on the merits against somebody else who is a partner of mine in a separate endeavor, and he's very strong on his positions. So if I come in with an abundant mentality and personal detachment and good intentions, there's a pretty good chance he's just going to roll over on me and or roll over me, and his position will take the day. Because what if he doesn't have these things? What if he thinks that there's only one right answer, and then if his answer isn't the right answer, then that means he doesn't have any value. He may still have good intentions, but those two things I run into every once in a while. So if you have those things, but your you know colleague or corollary does not, how do you handle that?
It's a tough question. I think I'll say the opposite of where it's easy to apply. It's easy to apply with prospects because you can walk away, right? These aren't, this isn't a spouse. This isn't a business partner. Those are not things you just naturally can quickly walk away from. And so that then comes into the point of relational and colleague selection. You've got to be really smart about who you link your wagon to, right? But let's say you're in a situation where that individual doesn't have that. I think you're in a real challenge. You've got to work through that with the individual, and perhaps stand your ground more often. And just because you show up with that software in your hardware, it doesn't mean you don't advocate and fight for what's right, right? So detachment doesn't mean you don't care. Detachment doesn't mean that you cease to have values or core principles. It just means that you're not going to get internally. It's not going to viscerally impact your personal value as a human when you're in these conflicts. So you can still stand for what's right, and you can still have conflict. And let's be clear, conflict is healthy when done well. But it just means that you sort of lower the blood pressure of what it means to you as a person and how it personally impacts you. That's what the detachment piece is. So it doesn't prevent you from arguing with your business partner about things that really matter. Because quite frankly, if it didn't matter, you wouldn't be arguing, right?
Right.
And then you get into the idea of negotiations, of integrative negotiation, right? Which is wait a second, let's both come together from the same side. And instead of splitting up a small pie of you're right and I'm wrong, why don't we grow the pie to something that's bigger together and then decide what the right answer is? So, not to get too much into the science of negotiation, but if you were to Google the term integrative negotiation, you would find there's this whole, there's textbooks, there's research on integrative negotiation where instead of showing up and you and I are working on a price of something, and you've got a non-negotiable stopping point, and I've got a non-negotiable stopping point. Instead, you kind of have to grow the pie to something where we both win more, and therefore there's more value exchange, and there's more to split up in a negotiation. So,
Yeah, that's good stuff.
you know,
We've talked a lot about active listening. What about body language? How does that come into play?
oh, it's huge. Gavin will remember this. At least 70% of communication is body language. So a good example would be, we're seeing each other visually on this podcast, right? Well, what if I had my cell phone out and I was, checking my, well, fantasy football is not a good example because it's over. I finished third in both leagues. Thank you very much. But if I was, scrolling on Instagram, looking at my TikToks while you were asking questions, you would feel much less interested if I was, down doing this and not looking at you. That would say a lot about my intent and what I care about. You would, I'm watching you now to the extent I can. I can only see basically from your chest up. I'm looking for nods. I'm looking for head tilts, right? I'm looking for, are you understanding? Do I need to clarify things? I'm looking for eye contact. So a big part of it is not the words we use, but the body position, the tonality of our words. Um, and what's so crazy about it is you don't have to be a scientist on body language. Some of this stuff is just innately known. You just know it when it happens. You can feel when somebody's not jibing with you, right? And you don't have to be a scientist to know that. It's stuff we're born. It's hardwired into our knowledge of body language. Obviously, there's some cultural differences around the world, but it's all pretty like we're born with it, and when people are connecting and when they're paying attention to you and when they're not, just based on body language. If I show up like this in every culture, and if I don't know if people are going to see this on the podcast, but my shoulders are hunched and my arms are folded. Well, what does that communicate to you? I'm uncomfortable, right? Versus if I'm like this guy's open, he's relaxed, he's cool. Man, it's huge. It is huge, and that's been a huge challenge with the pandemic because we only get 30% of the body, and it's a pretty important micro expressions on the face. But there's a lot happening, my chest and down. In fact, I'm wearing shorts right now. But you don't see if my leg is tapping. You don't see if my toes are pointed towards you. These are all cues and clues about whether we're connected and in sync from a body language perspective.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought up tone. It's not something I typically think of when I'm thinking of body language, but certainly important in communication. I get a lot of feedback that I have terrible tone. I get it from my mother. I get it from my fiance. I haven't gotten it from people at work yet, and I think that might just be they don't have like they don't feel brave enough to tell me. Maybe maybe Gavin will tell me after this they're all right, but I think at a certain point like they probably are right, because if I can't hear it but clearly everybody else is. So how do you improve that? Because I can tell you, like, for me, I really put a lot of effort into my tone because I know this is a problem, and I got told literally over the weekend, Caroline, it's your tone. so, so I know it's not working. So how do you fix this? Because I can tell you, like, I don't know when I'm doing this, right? But I know this is a problem, and I can imagine, or I would hope there are other people out there too who have this problem and are like, I'm trying really hard not to do this, but it's not working.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So I'll say one thing generally about tone that's a good example so people can understand tone. Then I'll say what's easy for you to do, and then I'll give you a hard thing to do. So think when people are like, I don't get tone, like, how does that true? Think about a dog. Like, a lot of us have been dog owners or pet owners, right? You can go to your dog and say, you're such an idiot. I love you so, you're right. I hate you so much. You're a dumb dog. And they're just happy, right? That's tone. So the dog doesn't understand your actual words. Your dog picks up on the tonality. Versus if I went to the dog and said, I love you. You are the best dog ever. The dog will cower. That's tone. Well, guess what? We humans, we're smarter than dogs, but we're not quite the same. So that's what we mean by tone, right? So the words don't matter as much as the tonality. All right. So what's the easy thing for you to do? I think, Caroline, the easy thing for you to do, easier, because none of this is easy, is self improvement, is go to those people closest to you, your mom, your fiance, your key coworkers, and say, I'm working on tone right now, and I'm giving you permission that at the end of a one on one or a key conversation, it doesn't have to be every time because that would get annoying. I want you to give me instantaneous feedback on my tone because you'll be aware, they'll be aware, and in the moment, you can quickly sort of remember how you were and they can give you feedback. So that's like a feedback mechanism. But you've got to listen, nobody's gonna come out of the woodwork like your mom and fiance might and talk about tone, right? So give people at work permission to say it's something you're actively working on and you want their feedback, not every time, because that would be brutal. The other thing that I thought of, and I think I might be naturally good at this because of where I was raised in the theater. My dad was a professional stage actor, taught theater and stage management at a private liberal arts college. And so I grew up in the theater. And you think about acting and you see the tonality of actors. And so if you really wanted to do something hard, you could take some acting classes and you would instantly understand the the fact that you have a range of tonality that you have control over. You do it in a fake situation in acting, but it then would apply to you in the real world and be able to be better in control of tonality. So I would say number one is give people permission. That's easy to do. Number two, which would be a big leap, is take an acting class, and you'll quickly understand.
That would be a leap. I will think about that though. We'll see. It probably would help me a lot.
I think, Caroline, you should
Yeah.
definitely take an acting class.
Yeah. See,
And
here's the
and
thing. You can't give me ideas like this when Greg's on the line because he'll really make me do it.
and then
Well,
you're going to do a one-woman play for the entire Argument
No,
team.
that's not happening.
I'm
No,
signing it
no.
up.
you're the only reason you're taking the acting class is not to actually act in a performance, unless you decide you want to. But instead, it's a public speaking. It's a self improvement way to
I
get at
mean,
it.
growing up, I was told that I was dramatic enough to be successful in the acting industry. So I could realize an unknown talent here. We'll see. But no, I thank you for that feedback because it is something that I struggle with. Hopefully, other people out there find this useful. Um, and I think, yeah, yeah, that's
Or or that's also in when you watch college athletics, when people do this, they call that the double cobra, and it means your team has just lost a football game and you've given up. That's the other. Yeah. Yeah, it sucks. I mean, I get that that's why you're comfortable, but if I were in a meeting with you and your arms were crossed only because you're comfortable, I have no other way interpreting that than you're closed off or frustrated, right? Like there's no other way for my like it's a default interpretation. Now, if I got to know you and you told me, Paul, I just sit like that because I'm comfortable, I would work through it probably, right? But even subconsciously, my brain is processing that as Greg is frustrated. He's not open to this. Greg doesn't quite like it, right? Um, so we have it's not a perfect science, and you can't like be perfect all the time. But it kind of reminded me like Ron Burgundy. Oh, where do I even put my hands? I'm not sure, right? Yeah. So it's pretty awkward for sure.
So, and then you also mentioned you look for head nods and things like that, and Archimate is a big predictive index user,
Yeah.
and so I'm a low B, which means
You're not expressive.
I don't have a lot of nonverbal, and so the way they described it is if you're talking to a high B who's presenting an idea, and then the high B is presenting their idea that they've they care about and they've invested in, and they're ready to present it to you and eager to see how you view it. And then my natural instinct would be like this. So my arms are crossed. I'm not expressive, no smile, no head nods. Um, the little bubble above the high B is he hates my idea. I can't believe I presented the idea. I want to go leave this meeting as soon as possible. Whereas the above my head with my arms crossed without expression is this is a fantastic idea. I can't wait to implement it. And that's how I'm wired, right? So it's sort of hard to overcome on a consistent basis because it's a naturally wired way.
Yeah, so our office is big on predictive index as well. And I'm a highest B. You probably figured that out already based on just watching me in the last 30 minutes.
Oh yeah, big time.
Um, the Here's what I always say. I believe, and I'm not much into hierarchy, but here's one time where I think it matters. I think it is the leader's job to adapt to the style of whoever else is in the room, right? So, Greg, if you're the highest ranking person in the room, as hard as it is for you to not be expressive, you at least need to move to the middle. If you're in a room with other high Bs that are reporting to you or you're leading in a project, because it's your job as a leader to remove barriers and make them as comfortable as possible to get their job done. That's hard, man, and that's why leadership can be a lonely place because we're asked to adapt our style a lot of times, right? Now, good example, the opposite direction. I was just presenting. This is funny. I was just presenting to a group of certified public accountants (CPAs) who generally are not high Bs, who are very analytical thinkers, and they process quietly. And I'm kind of a guy who tells dad jokes, yucks it up, and there was like 70 of them in a room, and I'm giving a presentation. And so what I did was, for me, I lowered my beat a little bit. Now they probably still felt uncomfortable, but I got closer to where they were, and I didn't tell as many jokes, and I wasn't nearly as expressive, and I used shorter sentences, and I used less flowery language because for them, as I was the leader in that situation, right? I was the presenter. I held the power in the room, and I knew for them to get as much out of it, I needed to speak on their terms. Now, if you would poll them, they would have said Paul is really high energy. That was crazy. But if they had seen the natural Paul, they may have walked out of the room because it would have been too much.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think I got I got a lot out of this conversation, Greg. It sounds like you did too.
Oh, for sure.
We are two low Bs, and so I think we both struggle with the I'm just thinking body language, but it comes off as like just don't come near me, and I hate your idea.
Although
So that
Caroline,
it's
because
good
we're
that we.
both low Bs, we communicate with each other so well
Oh yeah, no,
because
me
we
and
don't
Greg
need
do
anything
well.
from each other. We don't need head nods and
It's like a mind meld.
engage.
It's like a
Yeah,
mind meld.
It's wonderful.
once Greg and I had that, now our emails have gotten so much shorter. It's like one line. There's no introduction. It's a
Yeah, I
lot
don't
more.
have to say hi, Caroline. How are you? And then at the end,
No,
I
I'm
hope you
like, I
have a
don't.
wonderful weekend. We just
I'm
say
like, Greg,
like,
I don't care.
yeah, exactly.
That's awesome.
No. But yeah, so I think this was helpful. I think we covered a lot of good ground. Thank you so much for coming on. I can tell why Gavin loved your class so much, and I feel like we learned a lot in our short time together. Um, yeah, I thank you for coming on, and hopefully we can connect again in the future. Next time somebody tells me my tone sucks, I'll shoot you an email and say it worked. Now I just have to figure it out. So
That's right. Yeah, instant
yeah.
feedback is always valuable, and I'd love to come back on the podcast off air. We were talking about wine, so we can have a wine conversation next
Yes.
time.
That would
Yeah,
be
I would
great.
love that.
And
Yeah.
we'll link first person to in
Mhm.
the comments so that people can see the awesome organization where you work and find you if they need your services.
Sure, that'd be awesome. We'd love that.
Well, thanks, Paul. And since you're a high B, I'll say have a wonderful weekend. And I'm nodding and being expressive for our listeners. So thanks so
And
much.
since you're a highest A and lowest B, I'll just stay silent.
All right. Take care. It's most fun. Thanks so much.
See ya.
Well, that was a lot of fun. As I mentioned, we've heard a lot about Paul Ashley from Gavin along the way, and we were really excited to actually get to meet him. We talked about a lot. He is clearly an extrovert, which was fun for Greg and I. Bring out some of our character a little bit more. But Greg, what did you take away from this?
Well, there was a lot. I mean, I'm looking at the notes I took, and it's full. Um,
Yeah.
One of the things he said, he gave us a formula. You know, we
Mhm.
asked him, "How do you become a better listener or a more active listener?" And his formula was pretty simple, although on paper. Uh, Remain ridiculously curious. And I think that if you know, what's the buzzwords these days? Lean in. I think if you lean into a conversation and you're really curious and you want to know what that other person says or feels or thinks, that can make you a better, smarter, and more knowledgeable person. If you buy into that, then you'll be a more active listener because you want to be better, you want to be smarter, and you want to be more knowledgeable.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it made me think back, years ago, I was with one of my sister's friends, and he was notorious for making friends with everybody. If he was in a cab, he knew this driver's entire life story after, like, a 15-minute drive with him. And I asked him, I'm like, how do you make so many friends? And he had a very similar answer to me. And it was, I genuinely want to know everything about these people. I am so curious. He's like, I just ask questions. That's all I do. And I end up hearing all these amazing stories because of it. And so when Paul said that, I immediately went back to that moment. And it's so true. I mean, people like to talk about themselves, and Paul mentioned that as well. And if you can get them talking, you can learn so much about them, and learn so much about who they are and where they come from and maybe what they need from you as well.
Yeah, I am still going to, when I get in cabs, stare out the window and not say anything.
Yeah,
And
me too. Don't worry.
and that's how I restore myself. You know, is taking some time. But when I'm interacting with somebody, um, you know, it's a silence that sort of gets awkward, and you think you need to fill that silence. You know, those I always thought for a long time that awkward silences or pauses meant I wasn't quick-witted enough or smart enough, you know, to have the reply ready. So I would formulate my retort while somebody else was still talking, and you can't really actively listen if you're just sort of biding your time and until you can, you know, sort of unleash your retort. And so I think, and then he, you know, Paul said, "Hey, silence. It's an awkward tool, but it's a powerful one." And I thought, well, that's really interesting. You know, why not take 5, 10 seconds to process what you just heard, think about it, and then formulate a response? There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, yeah, and I think, though those seconds can be awkward, but when, the person on the receiving end can hear that you have this thoughtful response or maybe a follow-up question, I think that awkwardness immediately goes out the window. Because I've been on the other end of that, and it's like, oh, this person was thinking, right? They weren't trying to make me feel uncomfortable. They wanted to give me a thoughtful answer. And I know, Greg, you brought up, we can feel really comfortable talking to people when we have like a job to do, but it can be awkward when we're one on one. And I think the listening can help with that, like remembering to actively listen and just hear what people are actually saying and be curious.
Yeah, and it sort of runs the gamut. You know, Caroline, you and I have worked with each other and known each other for many years, and so and we extend each other a little grace, so we can just, you know, talk, and it doesn't have to be planned out or stressful or anything like that. But sometimes when you're in an environment where you have new relationships, you know, you sort of navigate exactly, you know, how to get the most out of the interaction or discussion. And and I asked Paul about that, and he said, "Look, there's critical issues where you're going to advocate till the, you know, you're going to die on that hill.
Hmm.
But then there are other issues. So rather than dig in, you know, with your position, with your right answer, you can discover the root of it all with a bunch of questions, and that can produce a number of possible outcomes. And then you can trust that the group and the discussion that follows will produce the best outcome. The best outcome will win on the merits. And again, he separates those critical issues where you're dying on the hill. And I think that's a great way to approach it. It's not so much that I need to have the right answer, but that I need to have great questions that ultimately will produce the right answer.
Well, and there are times where there's really one right answer. Of course, he brought up if there's like an ethical situation we're looking at, and there's one ethical thing to do that we need to do, or if we're looking at, being legally compliant, of course we want to make sure we're doing everything we can to be compliant in that regard. But he also brought up, if there's a situation where maybe there is a little bit of flexibility, but you do want to have more control over it, give people options. So even if these are options, make sure they're options that you are comfortable with, but then let your team decide where to go and discuss the best one. And that way, you're giving these options that will be compliant with whether it's ethically, legally, or just, company values. But they still get to have that say. And I think that's really valuable, people having that input, whether it's just whatever option they want to choose, or if they have a given set of things that they can choose from. Having that discussion and voice is really important.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that led into that blind zebra
Yes.
consulting story. Brian Neal, who laid out a couple key components, characteristics that would produce this kind of good discussion. One is the abundant mentality versus the scarcity mentality. In other words, there are not there's not just one good answer, one right answer. There are multiple good answers, multiple options, not just one. And when you see that and believe that, then you don't necessarily need to die on every single hill based on your answer. Two, personal detachment. If the chosen outcome is not the one you brought into the room, but the one someone else brought into the room, this does not mean you have no value. It's not about you. And then three, good intentions. You want the best, your colleagues want the best, the person with whom you're disagreeing about the right answer wants the best. And those three things, the abundant mentality, the personal detachment, and the good intentions, that's a great formula for a wonderful discussion where people are actively listening to one another with the best outcome to follow.
Yeah, and I like these three because I think depending on the person, you can say like, okay, I need to really work on one or two of these more than the others. Like I think about the personally detached, and I can get so dug in on how I want to do it, or if this way is the best, or I've put effort into thinking about my way. And that's so counterintuitive, and it does not help to get to the best solution. So it's a nice reminder. And I think that goes into abundance mentality too. Like I might have a great idea. Gavin might have a great idea. We just need to talk through them. It doesn't mean one's better than the other, but figure out what's going to work the best for now and be okay with that. Or maybe you come up with a combination of the two. But we can, I mean, I can dig my heels and I know that I can. So it's a good reminder to have um, for everyone when engaging in those discussions.
Yeah, and then sometimes you don't always get to choose your partner in a particular situation, and if
Yeah.
that person has a scarcity mentality and will think that their value is diminished if their answer doesn't win the day, that could be very difficult. And so sometimes you need to advocate a bit more strongly and resist a bit more, uh, but all the while avoiding your own negative visceral reactions. And I have a particular instance of like that, and I sort of struggle with it. I want to consider that there are multiple options, and this person that I'm dealing with only has one possible acceptable outcome, and it's the one they bring into the room. And it can be difficult, but this is helpful. I takes a little bit more advocacy, but it was helpful.
Yeah, and it certainly depends on the person you're talking to. But I think a lot of times, if you're working with somebody who comes in maybe a little standoffish or digging their heels in, sometimes them seeing somebody so open across the table from them can really just ease the tension. We've talked about that through leadership training and just being honest, maybe saying, hey, this is an uncomfortable discussion, or I really want to do what's best for the company. And I think getting aligned on those goals goes a long way. And sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you need to step up and advocate if things aren't going anywhere. But it gives you a good starting point to say, I'm going to go into this as open as I can and see where it goes. And if I need to pivot a little bit, then I can pivot.
Yeah. What did you think, Caroline, about the discussion around body language and tone?
Yeah, so this one was, I think, we talked about it, a little personal to me, but I think for one, body language, and Greg, you brought this up, like I am naturally comfortable with my arms crossed a lot of
Me
times.
too.
And we talk, or like if you're leaning back, and that might make you look disengaged, but really I'm just trying to get comfortable so I can listen as best as I can. But it really matters. And I can think of so many times, especially like if someone's on their phone, um, and maybe they're taking notes on what you're talking about, but like you won't know that. You just see somebody texting, and it has a huge impact on the people across from you. So it's definitely something to be aware of. As far as tone, I would like to add a follow up. So I did talk to my boyfriend, or my fiance, sorry, and he promised to tell me when my tone comes out immediately. And I also asked Gavin, and Gavin was a little hesitant, but I asked him to keep me on it. But I think we'll stay tuned on the acting class. Not sure if I'm confident enough to dive into that one yet, but we'll see. But I was appreciative of his tips, and I think it's just good to have some ideas to keep in mind when working on these things.
And for the record, I'm looking at Caroline on this screen. Arms are not crossed, so
No
tone is
crossed arms.
great. So you're
Thank
killing it.
you.
Good
Thank
job.
you. Yeah, we're not having a debate though.
That's true.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
would lose, so I don't want
Next
to have
time
a
we get in
debate.
an argument, you can tell me if if
I
my
promise
tone's
to
still
do it.
good. Okay.
This was great, though.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a fun one. In our next episode, we will be talking to Lindsay Picardo again, and this will be a part 2 to our discussion with her on generational gap.